Welcome, Cyborg Potato.
Aha, the color palette. Right there is ivory black, burnt sienna, and ivory white. Those are my three that I almost always put on the color palette. Part of that is I like to work from a black primer that has a red zenithal on top. That's cobalt blue with phthalo blue off to the side. Then I'll add cadmium yellow, very solid yellow. There's cadmium light red. And then I add alizarin crimson, along with what I don't show is burnt umber I added later. Well, let's set that palette off to the side and I'll get my little figures. And we'll start with that big fella there holding the stick. Already you'll notice that I'm using a rather large brush for a miniature. What this is a combination of cadmium and alizarin crimson with a little bit of ivory black. As you see, I'm using this color to base coat with this larger brush. Since he's got a big cloak, it's mostly his leg, leg, foot, and arms that get the red. Yeah, these Chaos Marines, they got that weird trim, and so you don't want to stress too much about going over them or whatever. Right here, I made the mistake of putting red where there shouldn't be, because on these Corsairs, their thigh is black, so I wetted it again and used the paper towel to get off. There we go, just like that, because it's acrylic and you can do that. Now with the arms, it's mostly just that bicep right there with that elbow. And yeah, I don't have painting handles, but it doesn't stop me from painting a good mini. Yeah, don't forget that other elbow. Now I'm applying more cadmium red medium paint mixed in with the previous paint colors to lighten it up a little bit. When working with acrylic, I really like to work dark to light. Part of that is layering up, as if you try to step too fast going from a really dark color with a straight up like really bright color like yellow or white immediately, you're not going to get the white that you want. Or even with other colors like red, you slowly build up with those layers. That way you eventually reach the brightness that you want. Now I start doing his headpiece, which will be a bone looking helmet, along with the horns on other pieces. I like to start with a burnt sienna, because it helps give that more warmth to it. It's a nice warm brown, and that way that will be the darkest part of it, and it'll all start to lighten up. Now for the skull on his stick, I start doing that. Remember, with base coating, it's broad strokes, a little more loose. You will get that tightness in there at the end when we start doing more detailed, more minute strokes. And, I'm getting the back of that right there. Now I'm getting all the little skulls on his little cloak here. Getting every little one with some burnt sienna. It's good stuff, I tell you. It's good stuff. Let's not forget this little guy. Now I'm working on the cloak here. I'm using burnt umber. It's different than burnt sienna. Burnt umber is a little darker, and so I wanted to differentiate that, because this is going to be plan is to have mixture of browns and such, and it'll lighten up too, but I want it to be fundamentally a different tone and hue. While I'm base coating, it's important to realize that you work in thinner coats. If you glob the paint on there, you'll get some unwanted texture. And the gloves I'm also basing in burnt umber. Those will remain pretty dark, as opposed to where the cloak will be lighter colored. And the little pistol holder, that's going back with some burnt sienna, along with this little scroll there. You don't always have to have a plan at the start. Sometimes it's helpful. Sometimes you kind of roll with it. Like the bones right there, I didn't quite get like I did his stick bonker and and his helmet, but his little top skull vent thingies, I decided to go with a bone. Some people might go with the metal. I wanted to emphasize the sort of boniness of this dude, so I was like, all these skulls up there, they gotta be burnt sienna too. Never underestimate burnt sienna. As you continue to, put base coats like I am here, the burnt sienna, you layer it on little bit by little bit, concentrating it more and more. Yeah, and even the little flaming skull will get little bits of burnt sienna. That'll contrast really well once we get the flame color on there, which I hadn't decided at this point. But I didn't come back and added some more red. And I did that because as I was waiting for the red, it was still a little bit wet. So that's where I come back in now, and it's dry. And I can add even more pop and more punch to that red where I want it. Emphasizing his foot because he's floating in the air. So to emphasize that floatiness, I want your eye to be drawn to his foot. To like, oh, he's floating. And the brightness of his arms being extended then kind of shows you that whole silhouette, as his silhouette is a triangle coming out. And so emphasizing especially that one foot and his two other arms helps emphasize that triangular shape of something going up and out. It's really quite brilliant with the sculpting, as it emphasizes the kind of energy this guy is projecting. Now I'm coming back and I'm just continuing to touch up, adding some more burnt sienna to all of this. And I just keep doing it. You layer it on, and what that does over time is, the way paint works is it interacts with layers, and so those thin layers that I got around everywhere, there'll be a little bit of burnt sienna, but you'll still see the black underneath, so it's darker. And then as I slowly layer it, the spots that have more and more burnt sienna are going to be more saturated, more bright. Now I'm coming in with a burnt sienna that's mixed in with some yellow and a little bit of white. And that's fundamentally what this bone color is going to be for the skulls, his helmet, his bonker stick, and all the horns. And even the bones on the back and his scroll are going to be similar color. As we follow that pattern, but I'm still leaving some of those other layers to create that shadow where it's darker. And this adds volumetric shading to it. It also adds interest. And so what I'm doing with his horns specifically is I'm leaving the parts where the horns connect to his skull helmet darker, purposely. And even with that skull on his bonker stick, those horns because it helps differentiate the horns from the skull. Even though those bones are connected, I want those shapes to be fundamentally different. And so as I add those highlights, those lighter and lighter colors on the horns and such, I want the tips of the horns to get lighter. Now, if his head was dark, then I'd probably invert it to create that differentiation of shape. But that's essentially one of the main things you want to shoot for with miniature painting, is to have that differentiation of shape. Is you want these are 3D shapes, injection molded plastic that you can touch and feel. Just as his cloak creates some shadow and some rest sculpturally, as we differentiate these shapes and get brighter and brighter in certain areas, we're creating points of interest. Rest and interest go hand in hand with each other, especially as this camera struggles to focus. But we'll get that figured out. There we go. That's a little better. And now as I turn the model, I'm looking to make sure I got things where I want it. Looking at, as you notice, I'm doing smaller dabs as I'm getting brighter and brighter and brighter. Picking out all those little spots, focusing more on the center parts of it. And thus we create the volumetric shapes. Oh, look at that. That's a marine I used. It was my test model. But here we are to what ended up being one of my favorite parts of the process. So as I'm layering more burnt umber on, I am purposely trying to make some of the folds and things stand out more, getting that base color. But as I continue, overall the whole color, it's very desaturated. But as I'm doing so, I'm doing a very loose stroking on it, as I'm going for a more weathered, textured cloak. And so as I'm doing this, as I start to get further and further, I employ more stippling type strokes that are more rough. I'm focusing more on the lower part of the cloak because that's where it's more ragged and that's where I'm trying to get the most texture. And that puts on this persona of this Chaos Space Marine. And so each more layer becomes more desaturated because each layer has more and more white. And when you focus on the outward folds, that makes the inside of the folds darker. And some of those previous layers aren't fully dry because I'm wanting it to kind of blend in some places and yet be rough and textured in other places. But eventually, you keep on adding more and more white. It's a process of layers, like I've said. And for some people, that's too much work. You're building an army. But for me, the painting is where I get the most joy out of, so I have no problem doing that. But I loved how the further I got on with the cloak, the more textured and the brighter it became, as the burnt umber on this creates this darker desaturation, whereas when I did the bones, I mixed in some yellow to give it some warmth. So that way, this cloak, as I'm adding more white, it becomes more cold, and thus the bones and the cloak on the back, even though they're similar colors, there's still a bit of differentiation between them. I mean, that's partially why up towards the cloak is darker, is to help break up that shape, but also to exaggerate the tears of the cloak down at the bottom. Now I'm going back and adding some more burnt umber to those gloves. Those gloves, you know, they're going to be dark, but we still need some brightness, some saturation to them. And with this stick, I go for more gray because I'm going for, like, he used a stick that was just laying out in the woods for a while. I wanted to give it that gnarly, that white gray ness to it. And very similar for the feathers on his pauldrons. I go in with a gray. Yes, there's the red and black base coat under it that gives it a little bit of warmth. So what as that does is it creates a warm shadow underneath, and so when I get colder and colder with the feathers, what that does is it creates that color contrast, or in this case, it's the warm versus cold. So cold highlights, warm shadows for those feathers. And you could say overall, he's pretty warm considering the blacks and the red undercoat. And now I'm working on the spooky flames. I am going with the green because, you know, normal fire is warm, so why not do something weird? This guy, you know, most of the time, or half the time, I don't know how much time, but, you know, he's from the warp. That's the energy he's drawing from. So to give this unworldly feeling, I'm going with green. And so I learned from previous models that as you go out with fire, you want that to be darker because the energy and the light from the fire is coming from the origin of the fire. And so, unlike a lot of cartoony fire where it's red in the middle and yellow on the outside, it should be reversed. Brightest on the inside, darkest as it goes out, and it's the ionic bonds that break when you burn stuff, wood in particular. It creates, fire is this chemical reaction that releases this kind of gassy heat that creates fire. And so as it goes up, it slowly disperses and widens until it dissipates. And I just used a lot of big words, but that's fire. In a nutshell, anyway. And so when you think about this, as I'm layering on the green, I go brighter and brighter. So I mix in yellow eventually. I was using the green that I'm using is a mixture of cadmium yellow and phthalo blue. Phthalo blue actually has a little bit of green in it. And I like that mixture because it creates a very rich green. And when you take this green mixture and start to brighten it up, it creates a much more saturated green. Because if, say, you took like a cobalt blue with the yellow, it creates a green, but it doesn't have that pop to it. So that's why I used phthalo green. Now I've highlighted like I've done with the other things, but here I'm putting pure white is actually the smallest part on the miniature, but it really elevates it. Look at those eyes. That really makes it pop. A lot of people refer to this as object source lighting, because the object itself is the source of the light. As I wrap up here, I always tend to do the undersuit in black, and I do it last, with all these other little details and such. A lot of it at the very end I didn't film because it was just really finicky, and it was also getting late. I painted all this in one sitting. But there you have it. I'll get to the base eventually. But here's what he looks like from behind with his two bros, and then ta-da! Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.